Within the quiet village of Scole in Norfolk, England, there sat a farmhouse with a cellar that would become the epicenter of the most controversial paranormal study in modern history. It was the year 1993, when the air grew heavy and the shadows seemed to detach themselves from the corners of the room. This was not merely a case of creaking floorboards or drafty corridors, but a systematic attempt to tear down the veil between the living and the dead. The basement of Robin Foy and Sandra Foy became a sanctuary for the impossible, where the laws of physics were seemingly suspended by unseen hands. Visitors who dared to enter this subterranean chamber reported a palpable density in the atmosphere, as if the air itself was watching them, waiting for the lights to fade. The experiment began with a desire to prove that death is not the end, but merely a transition to another state of existence. Robin Foy and his wife Sandra Foy, along with Alan Bennett and Diana Bennett, formed a circle dedicated to physical mediumship. They did not seek vague messages or feelings, but tangible proof that could be seen and touched and heard. They wanted to capture the voices of the departed on tape and imprint their images onto film. The group, which called itself the Scole Experimental Group, committed to sitting in absolute darkness twice a week. They believed that light was destructive to the ectoplasmic energy required for the spirits to manifest. So they sealed the windows and blocked every crack to ensure total blackness within the room. As the weeks turned into months, the four sitters sat in the suffocating dark, waiting for a sign from the other side. The silence of the cellar was often deafening, broken only by their own breathing and the rhythmic beating of their hearts. They played music to raise the vibrations in the room, hoping to provide the energy the spirits needed to break through. It was a test of patience and endurance, as sitting in pitch blackness for hours can play tricks on the human mind. Yet they persisted, driven by a conviction that they were on the verge of a breakthrough that would change the world. They felt a growing presence in the room, a static charge that made the hair on their arms stand up and the temperature drop suddenly. The first anomaly was subtle, a tiny point of light dancing in the void like a firefly trapped in a jar. It moved with intelligence, reacting to their requests and darting around the room with impossible speed. This was not a reflection or a trick of the eye, but a self-luminescent orb that seemed to possess a consciousness of its own. The sitters watched in awe as the light grew brighter and more distinct, swirling around them and passing through solid objects. It was the first physical confirmation that they were not alone in the cellar. The entity behind the light seemed to be testing the waters, probing the connection between their world and the one that lay just beyond the veil of darkness. Soon the phenomena escalated beyond mere lights into physical sensations that terrified and fascinated the group. Invisible hands touched their faces and stroked their hair with a gentleness that belied the fear such contact induced. They felt the heavy fabric of their clothes being tugged by unseen fingers and sensed movement in the empty spaces between their chairs. The atmosphere in the cellar became thick with ozone, and the smell of flowers would manifest out of nowhere, filling the stagnant air with the scent of a funeral parlor. These olfactory hallucinations were accompanied by distinct raps on the wooden table, responding to questions with intelligent precision. The entities were no longer just observing. They were interacting, participating in the seance with eager enthusiasm. The group established communication with a team of spirit guides who identified themselves as the creative force behind the phenomena. The primary communicator was a spirit named Manuel, who spoke through the medium with a distinct accent and a wealth of knowledge. Manuel explained that they were a group of scientists and observers from the afterlife, working to bridge the gap between dimensions. They claimed to be using the energy provided by the sitters to manipulate matter and create the physical manifestations. This claim of a collaborative effort between the living and the dead added a layer of complexity to the experiment, suggesting a structured and organized attempt at contact rather than random hauntings. One of the most chilling aspects of the Scole Experiment was the manifestation of physical objects from thin air known as apports. Coins and medallions and small trinkets would fall onto the table from the ceiling, often landing with a loud clatter that startled the sitters. These objects appeared to be gifts from the spirit team, physical proof of their ability to manipulate matter across dimensions. Some of the items were historical in nature, dating back to the war era, or earlier, suggesting they had been retrieved from a specific time and place. The sudden appearance of solid matter in a locked and sealed room defied all logical explanation, leaving the group oscillating between wonder and a creeping sense of unease. To validate their findings, the group invited guest sitters, including scientists and members of the Society for Psychical Research. These external observers were subjected to strict protocols, searched before entering, and seated in controlled positions. Despite the rigorous scrutiny, the phenomena continued unabated, often targeting the skeptics with personal touches and specific messages. Professors and engineers found themselves unable to explain the dancing lights or the levitating crystals that defied gravity. The skepticism of the visitors often crumbled in the face of the undeniable physical evidence presenting itself in the darkness. The cellar in Scole was becoming a courtroom where the laws of reality were put on trial and found wanting. The spirit team introduced a new method of communication, using photographic film to capture images from the other side. They instructed the group to place unopened rolls of film in a secure box on the table during the sessions. When the films were later developed They revealed impossible images and messages scrawled directly onto the emulsion. There were faces of unknown people diagrams, of strange devices, and verses of poetry written in handwriting that matched deceased relatives. These psychographs appeared on films that had never been exposed to light or a camera lens, suggesting a direct manipulation of the chemical layers by the spirits. The implications were staggering, implying that consciousness could interact with matter at a molecular level. Among the images captured on the film were references to the war years and symbols that required deep research to decipher. One particularly disturbing image showed a reflection of a face in a mirror that looked like a dimensional portal. The handwriting on the films often contained German phrases and references to scientific formulas that none of the sitters understood. Experts analyzed the films and found no evidence of tampering or physical manipulation of the rolls. The markings seemed to have been burned into the film by a localized radiation or light source from within the sealed canister. This was the holy grail of paranormal research, tangible and permanent evidence that could be analyzed in a laboratory. The auditory phenomena also evolved with voices manifesting independently of the mediums in the room. These direct voice phenomena seemed to originate from mid-air, floating above the table, or whispering directly into the ears of the sitters. The voices were distinct, with different timbres and accents, often speaking over one another in a cacophony of spirit chatter. They recorded these voices on cassette tapes, capturing conversations that sounded like they were being transmitted through a radio from a distant station. The clarity of the recordings was startling, with the spirits answering questions in real time and reacting to the comments made by the group. It was as if the cellar had become a telephone booth to the afterlife. As the experiment gained notoriety, the intensity of the phenomena reached a fever pitch that began to worry the sitters. The energy in the room became so strong that it felt physically heavy, pressing down on their chests and making it difficult to breathe. Large objects would levitate and fly across the room, crashing into walls with violent force. The table itself would buck and dance like a living thing, lifting off the floor and spinning in the air. The playfulness of the early sessions was replaced by a raw power that seemed difficult to control. The group began to wonder if they had opened a door that they could not easily close, unleashing forces that were growing stronger with every session. During one particularly intense session, a guest sitter reported feeling a hand grab his ankle and pull violently, almost dragging him off his chair. Another visitor claimed to see a full materialization of a spirit figure standing in the corner of the room, glowing with a pale blue light. The boundaries of safety were being tested, and the psychological toll on the group was becoming evident. They They were exhausted and drained, constantly living in the shadow of the events taking place in their cellar. The line between their normal lives and the nightly seances was blurring, making it hard to disconnect from the spirit world. The entities were becoming a constant presence, even outside the seance room. The scientists investigating the case, including Monty Keene and Arthur Ellison and David Fontana, were baffled by the lack of fraud they could detect. They brought their own equipment and films, sealing them in tamper-proof bags and holding onto them throughout the sessions. Yet the images still appeared, and the lights still danced around their heads. They published a report known as the Scole Report, which detailed their findings and argued that the phenomena could not be explained by normal means. This validation from the scientific community gave the Scole Experiment a legitimacy that few other paranormal cases had ever achieved. However, it also attracted critics who were determined to prove it was all an elaborate hoax. Skeptics pointed out that the refusal to allow infrared cameras or light during the sessions was a major red flag. They argued that the darkness provided the perfect cover for trickery, and that the sitters could be using sleight of hand to create the effects. The group countered that the spirit team had explicitly warned that light would harm the medium and stop the phenomena. This stalemate between the need for scientific observation and the requirements of the spirits created a tension that hung over the entire experiment. The group felt they were being judged unfairly, while the skeptics felt they were being asked to suspend their critical faculties. The debate raged on fueling the controversy. The spirit team eventually proposed a grand experiment involving a video camera to record the manifestations in the dark. They promised to illuminate the room with their own spirit light, allowing the camera to capture the figures and faces of the communicators. The group prepared for this historic event, setting up the equipment and waiting with bated breath for the results. When the session began, the room was filled with a brilliant light that did not come from any bulb or flame. It swirled and coalesced into shapes, but the video footage was distorted and grainy, failing to provide the definitive proof they hoped for. It was a tantalizing glimpse, but it remained just out of reach of clear validation. Strange crystalline stones began to appear during the sessions, unlike any geological specimens found in the local area. These stones were analyzed and found to have anomalies in their composition that puzzled geologists. The group believed they were apports from other planets or dimensions brought by the spirit team as gifts. The sheer number of objects that materialized in the closed room was staggering, ranging from newspapers to jewelry. Each item was cataloged and stored, but their origin remained a mystery that defied rational explanation. The cellar was becoming a museum of the impossible, a collection of artifacts that had no business existing in our reality. The emotional weight of communicating with the dead began to cause friction within the group and their families. The intensity of the focus required to maintain the connection was draining their vital energy. Robin Foy and Sandra Foy found their home invaded by the curious and the desperate, all seeking answers about the afterlife. The privacy of their sanctuary was compromised, and the sacred nature of the experiment was threatened by the circus that was forming around it. They had started with a pure intention to explore the unknown, but the consequences of their success were becoming a heavy burden to bear. The shadows in the cellar seemed to be lengthening, reaching out into their daily lives. One evening, a terrifying incident occurred when a heavy crystal base was thrown across the room, narrowly missing the head of a sitter. The violence of the act shocked the group and raised questions about the benevolence of the spirits they were contacting. Was it possible that other less friendly entities were slipping through the open door? The spirit team apologized, claiming it was a buildup of uncontrolled energy, but the fear lingered. The trust between the sitters and the unseen forces was shaken, reminding them of the inherent dangers of physical mediumship. They were dealing with forces they could not see and definitely could not control. The concept of the Scole Experiment was not just about ghosts, but about interdimensional travel and time manipulation. The spirits spoke of traveling through the ether and manipulating the fabric of time to deliver messages. This science fiction aspect of the case made it unique, blending traditional spiritualism with quantum physics concepts. The communicators seemed eager to teach the group about the nature of reality, explaining that time was an illusion and that all moments existed simultaneously. These complex philosophical discussions were recorded on tape, providing a dense library of information that is still being studied today by enthusiasts. As the millennium approached, the spirit team announced that the experiment was nearing its conclusion. They had achieved what they set out to do, which was to provide evidence of survival after death. They warned that continuing the sessions could be dangerous for the health of the mediums. The energy required to produce the physical phenomena was taking a toll on their bodies and minds. The group received instructions to dismantle the experiment and close the portal they had opened. It was a bittersweet moment, as they had dedicated years of their lives to this pursuit. The silence of the cellar was about to return. The final sessions were marked by a sense of urgency and a flurry of activity from the spirit team. They produced more films and more reports, as if trying to leave as much evidence as possible before the door closed. The lights danced with a frantic energy, and the voices spoke with a finality that brought tears to the eyes of the sitters. They knew they were witnessing the end of an era, a unique chapter in the history of the paranormal. The bond they had formed with Manuel and the other guides was strong, and saying goodbye was like losing a close friend. The experiment was ending, but the questions remained. In November of 1998, the Scole Experiment officially came to an end. The group disbanded, and the cellar was returned to its mundane purpose. However, the legacy of what happened there continued to ripple through the paranormal community. The Scole Report was published, sparking debates that continue to this day. Believers saw it as the ultimate proof of the afterlife, while skeptics dismissed it as a clever fraud. The sheer volume of data and the quality of the witnesses made it difficult to ignore completely. It remains a thorn in the side of materialist science, a collection of anomalies that refuses to fit into the standard model of reality. Critics focused on the fact that Robin Foy and Alan Bennett were experienced in magic and illusion, suggesting they had the skills to fake the phenomena. They analyzed the films and claimed that the effects could be reproduced using LEDs and chemical tricks. However, no one was ever caught in the act of deception, and the sitters maintained their innocence until the end. The complexity of the phenomena and the duration of the experiment made the hoax theory difficult to sustain. Without assuming a massive conspiracy involving dozens of people, the question remained why they would dedicate years of their lives to such an elaborate charade for little financial gain. The psychological impact on the participants was profound, changing their views on life and death forever. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back, whispering secrets of eternity. They could no longer view the world as a purely material place, having seen the fluidity of matter and the persistence of consciousness. The experience isolated them in some ways, as few people could understand what they had been through. They carried the burden of knowledge that challenged the foundations of society and religion. They were travelers who had returned from a strange land, forever altered by the journey. The audio recordings from Scole remain some of the most compelling evidence of the experiment. The voices do not sound like typical electronic voice phenomena, but distinct personalities engaging in conversation. Analysis of the tapes revealed acoustic properties that were difficult to replicate with human vocal cords. The lack of breath sounds and the overlapping of voices suggested a source that was not biological. These tapes serve as a haunting reminder of the nights spent in the dark, listening to the whispers of the dead. They are a sonic legacy of a time when the barrier between worlds was remarkably thin. One specific experiment involved a device called the germanium device, which the spirits instructed the group to build. It was a receiver designed to amplify the spirit voices and allow for clearer communication. The technical schematics were provided by the spirit team, and the device was constructed by the group. When activated, it did indeed facilitate better communication, purportedly using germanium crystals to bridge the dimensional gap. This collaboration on technical hardware was unprecedented, suggesting that the spirits retained their scientific knowledge and interest in technology, even after death. It blurred the line between spiritualism and fringe science. The mystery of the illuminated films remains the most debated aspect of the case. One film strip showed a perfect roll of handwriting that stretched continuously along the length of the film, ignoring the frame dividers. This would be incredibly difficult to fake without specialized equipment that the group did not possess. Another film showed a dragon-like symbol that was later identified as a hermetic seal relating to alchemy. The esoteric nature of the imagery suggested a deep intelligence behind the messages drawing from a well of occult knowledge. It was a puzzle left for the living to solve a series of clues leading to a greater truth. Despite the end of the experiment, the energy at the farmhouse in Scole did not dissipate immediately. The Foys reported continuing phenomena in the house, with objects moving and lights appearing long after the circle had broken. It seemed that the portal they had opened had left a residual charge in the very structure of the building. The house itself had become a battery of paranormal energy stored up over years of intense sessions. It served as a warning that meddling with such forces has long-term consequences that cannot be easily undone. The genie had been let out of the bottle, and it was reluctant to go back in. The Scole Experiment stands as a challenge to the scientific method, highlighting the difficulties of studying sporadic and intelligent phenomena. Science demands repeatability and control conditions that are often impossible to impose on a seance. The spirits claimed to be sentient beings, not lab rats, and refused to perform on demand for skeptics who approached with hostility. This clash of worldviews is central to the debate over the validity of the experiment. Can science ever truly investigate the spiritual if it refuses to accept the premise of a non-material reality? Scole forced these questions into the spotlight. Many researchers argue that the Scole Experiment is the most convincing case of physical mediumship since the glory days of the Victorian era. It revived interest in a dying art form and inspired new groups to attempt similar experiments around the world. The protocols developed at Scole have become a blueprint for modern circles attempting to replicate their success. However, few have managed to achieve the same level of intensity and consistency. It seems that the specific combination of people and location and time created a unique storm that may never be repeated. It was a moment of lightning in a bottle. The involvement of the Society for Psychical Research gave the case a gravitas that prevented it from being easily dismissed as tabloid fodder. These were serious men with academic reputations to protect, yet they put their names on a report that supported the paranormal explanation. Their endorsement caused a rift in the organization, with hardline skeptics attacking their methodology and conclusions. The internal politics of the paranormal research community were laid bare, revealing the deep biases that exist on both sides. Scole became a battleground for the soul of psychical research, forcing everyone to take a side. Detailed analysis of the light phenomena revealed that the orbs were not simple point sources of light. Some appeared to have structure and texture, resembling plasma or electrified gas. They could pass through the bodies of the sitters without causing harm, yet were solid enough to cast shadows. The behavior of these lights suggested they were the localized manifestation of the spirit entities. They were the visible fingertips of the ghosts, probing our reality and interacting with the environment. To witness such a display in a pitch-black cellar was to witness the impossible made manifest. The lingering question is what the Scole Experiment actually proved. Did it prove life after death? Or did it prove the untapped power of the human mind? Some parapsychologists suggest that the phenomena were created by the subconscious minds of the sitters, a massive projection of psychokinetic energy. This theory, known as the super psi hypothesis, argues that we are capable of manipulating matter and creating illusions without realizing it. If true, it suggests that the human potential is far greater and more terrifying than we imagine. We may be the ghosts haunting our own reality. Even years later, the surviving members of the group stand by their testimony, refusing to recant a single detail. They maintain that what they experienced was genuine spirit communication, orchestrated by a team of benevolent entities. They have faced ridicule and accusation, but their story has remained consistent. The bond forged in that dark cellar has withstood the test of time and the pressure of public scrutiny. They are the keepers of a secret history, witnesses to a miracle that the world is not yet ready to accept. Their conviction is perhaps the most persuasive evidence of all. The films and tapes and transcripts from Scole are preserved as a testament to the experiment, waiting for future generations to analyze them with new technology. Perhaps one day we will have the tools to unlock the secrets hidden in the audio waveforms and the chemical emulsion. Until then, they remain anomalous data points that refuse to fit into the puzzle of scientific materialism. They are the breadcrumbs left by travelers who ventured further than most dared to go. The archive of the Scole Experiment is a time capsule from the edge of reality. Today, the village of Scole remains quiet its dark history, hidden behind the facade of rural tranquility. The farmhouse still stands, but the cellar is silent, no longer echoing with the voices of the dead. Yet for those who know the story, the village is a landmark on the map of the unknown. It is a place where the wall between worlds was breached, and for a brief time, the dead walked among the living. The memory of the experiment hangs over the location like a mist, a subtle reminder that reality is not as solid as it seems. The Scole Experiment serves as a modern ghost story that does not rely on folklore or legend, but on documented observation. It challenges us to look into the dark and not be afraid of what might look back. It asks us to consider the possibility that we are surrounded by an invisible universe teeming with intelligence and life. The fear it invokes is not the fear of a monster, but the fear of the unknown, the vertigo of realizing that our understanding of the universe is woefully incomplete. It is a story that does not end with a period, but with a question mark. Ultimately, the Scole Experiment is a mirror reflecting our own beliefs and fears about death. For the believer, it is a beacon of hope, a promise of continuity. For the skeptic, it is a puzzle to be solved, a trick to be exposed. But for those who sat in the darkness of that cellar, it was a transformative experience that shattered their perception of reality. They touched the other side, and the other side touched them back, leaving a mark that would never fade. The true horror and wonder of Scole lies in the possibility that it was all real. As we leave the damp cellar of Scole behind, we are left with a lingering dread that perhaps the door was never fully closed. The entities that visited that room demonstrated a power and intelligence that dwarfs our own. They came and went as they pleased, manipulating our reality like a child playing with toys. If they could enter that cellar, what is to stop them from entering our homes, our minds, our dreams? The experiment may be over, but the presence remains, watching from the shadows, waiting for the lights to go out once more. The silence that follows a ghost story is often the most terrifying part, and the silence of Scole is deafening. It is the silence of unanswered questions, of secrets kept in the dark. It challenges us to sleep soundly, knowing that the walls of our reality are paper thin. The Scole Experiment proved that if you stare long enough into the darkness, something will eventually materialize to stare back. And once you have seen it, you can never unsee it. The ghosts of Scole are still waiting in the dark. So the next time you find yourself in total darkness, listen closely to the silence. Feel the air around you for a shift in density, a drop in temperature. Remember the 4 people in a Norfolk cellar who invited the unknown into their lives and got exactly what they asked for. The Scole Experiment is not just a story from the past. It is a warning for the present. The barrier is fragile, and there are things on the other side scratching at the surface, desperate to be let in. Do not ask for proof unless you are prepared to face the answer.